Hey everyone, welcome back to English 112 here at Delta College. This is week 5. This week we're going to discuss rhetoric in advertising, so building on what we discussed last week. And then we're going to discuss logic and fallacies. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay. So when it comes to rhetoric in advertising, there is always going to be a great deal of pathos involved. And pathos, as you'll recall from last time, is the use of emotional manipulation or rooting your argument in provoking some sort of emotional response. And advertisers know that if you want people to buy something that they probably don't have a real need for, you have to convince them on the emotional level. You have to make them feel like they need it for whatever reason. And so they will use emotional appeals in their advertising. Now, typically, the emotional manipulation is going to be fairly moderate. Often, advertisements, probably the most successful ones, are those which tend to be more humorous and entertaining. But at the same time, you do get some which really rely on some scare tactics in order uh, to get you to buy the product by scaring you into doing so, because the suggestion is it would be disastrous if you did not buy that product. For a classic example of that scare tactic being used in advertising, pause this video and go take a look at the Lyndon Johnson campaign video called Daisy, which I've linked here on e-learning. Go ahead and take a look at that and let's see what you think. Okay, quite extreme, isn't it? And personally, I find that that commercial to be really funny because it is so extreme and so absurd. It's almost satirical. But unlike, say, Jonathan Swift, his brand of satire, which isn't meant to be taken seriously, rather it's extreme in order to draw attention to a problem, that ad is meant to be taken seriously. You're meant to take it at face value. And you'll see that quite a lot in political advertising, a lot of um, emotional manipulation, a lot of appealing to public sentiment or beliefs. And we'll get into that when we start discussing fallacies, because it really is, when the emotions are manipulated to that extreme, it's a logical fallacy called ad misericordiam. But we'll get to that a little bit later. And so when you look at all of these ads, which I've listed here, and I've also linked to e-learning, you'll see that most tend not to be that extreme in the use of scare tactics. So if you look, for example, at the Broadview security ad, Backyard, you'll see that it's, even though it is trying to provoke a fear response, it's nowhere near as extreme as what you see in the Lyndon Johnson ad. So go ahead and pause here and take a look at that one. So that's another ad which always makes me laugh, because it's more silly than absurd. I mean, it preys on our sort of instincts as people, and certainly if you're a parent, it's probably going to be much more effective. But it suggests the idea of what kind of parent would you be if you let your family be vulnerable to home invasion without having this security package that Broadview is selling you. Now, the scenario that they depict in their ad hardly ever happens. Yes, home invasions do occur, but if you look at the statistics, typically what happens is the home invasion is perpetrated by people who are known to the victim, their friends and family. And the reason for that, there's really two reasons for that. First of all, it's our friends and family who know what we have and know what our weaknesses are. And also, these are the people that we can really piss off enough that they would want uh, to harm us in some sense. So what they don't show in the ad is that you're much more likely to be a victim of a home invasion or harmed in your home by people that you know, by your family and friends. It's hardly ever by a stranger as depicted in that ad. Not a comforting thought, I know. It's probably more of a scary thought than what Broadview is trying to suggest. But the idea that they're trying to convey, their assertion is that if you don't have their security system, then you're leaving your family vulnerable to these sorts of victimhood. And what kind of parents, and more specifically, what kind of husband would you be? Notice that in that particular ad, the victims are the mother and the child. Life call and life alert. So the classic life call ad has that classic sort of tagline, "I've fallen and I can't get up," which everyone knows now. It's become kind of a joke. Although when the life call ads were first premiered back in the 1980s, yeah, it was still kind of silly, but it was more on the level of the Broadview security ad, that kind of silliness, where it takes a situation that is, okay, it's possible, plausible even, but it's not presented in uh, a really dramatic way. I mean, it's more of a silly or comedic way in which the scenario is being presented. And then later on, the Life Call company was bought out by Life Alert, who continued on that advertising. And then a few years ago, they updated their ad to the basement ad, which I've linked here. So take a look at that and compare it to the original Life Call ad. Quite an extreme difference, isn't it? The Life Alert basement ad is really disturbing now. And in fact, that ad was considered quite controversial because it scared a lot of people. And ultimately, Life Alert dropped it. But you see that sort of extreme use of the scare tactic, or the use of that pathos, that pathetic appeal being used in order to persuade. And then going into a different vein, take a look at the Hyundai ad for First Date. This is just much more humorous, although perhaps still disturbing in its own way. So take a look at that. Okay, so yeah, funny little scenario. You have Kevin Hart being overprotective of his daughter by having her date drive his car because his car can be tracked. So he follows along on their date, tracking his car in order to keep an eye on his daughter and her boyfriend or suitor here. Like I said, much more lighthearted, much more amusing and entertaining, although kind of disturbing in its own way because the behavior that Kevin Hart is portraying is really pretty psychotic, and it does send a negative message about overprotective fathers and uh, the sense that women and young women aren't capable of taking care of themselves and of making their own decisions. So a more successful ad, but still problematic. But each of those ads, you can see how they really lean into the use of that emotional manipulation and the use of the pathos. And again, the idea is, even if it's something which is meant to be lighthearted and entertaining, the idea is it appeals to some sort of insecurity that the audience has. And it creates a sense of anxiety in doing so. And the idea, the concept is, if you have that anxiety, if you buy that product will relieve that anxiety. Because we base a lot of our decisions, especially when it comes to purchases, on the way that we feel about things. Shift gears a little bit here and take a look at the way that music gets used in advertising. Now, music is a little problematic in its own way because as we discussed a little bit, or at least I think we discussed a little bit earlier on in the term, meaning is conveyed on three levels. You have context, text, and subtext. Text is the literal message that's the text is trying to convey. It's what it explicitly says. Subtext, which means undertext, is that which is not explicitly stated but is implied by the text. So you kind of have to read between the lines to get that message. So it's kind of the hidden meaning. But then context, which means with text, is the situation in which something is said. So text is what is said, subtext is what is implied, and then context is the situation in which something is said. And so the situation in which it's said can alter the meaning of the text itself. Now, advertisers used to use original music. They would commission some songwriter to make a jingle for their product, and hopefully the jingle would be very memorable, and then people would be able to keep that in mind when they went to the store, and when they saw the product, the idea was that it would spark the jingle to go off in their head. But then in the 1980s, we started seeing a shift in advertising away from using that original music, away from those jingles, to using licensed music, especially pop music. And one of the earliest companies to do this was Pepsi. The problem here is, well, I mean, the reasoning behind going towards licensed music, even though it's much more expensive to do that than to commission someone to write a jingle for you. The idea is that people have strong associations with music, pop music in particular. And so they have those strong feelings that we associate with those particular songs. We tend to associate music with particular times and places and feelings. And for the most part, people have positive associations, positive feelings associated with those songs. And so the idea is that there is a psychological transference that occurs when you hear that song in the context of an ad. So if you like the song, the implication is that you will like that product as well. So there is a sort of suggestion of celebrity endorsement, that if you like that particular artist, that artist supports this company, this brand, so you should too. So there is that connection there. But also, if you like a particular song and you hear it in the ad, then you'll be more likely to associate that song with that product. And so there's sort of a cross promotion going on. People, when they hear the song on the radio, for example, the hope is that they will think of that particular product that's associated with that song, and that when they see that product in a store, then they'll think of that particular artist and that artist's music. So like I said, Pepsi was one of the first companies to start doing this in the 1980s, using the music of Michael Jackson. And this is a classic advertisement, new generation. Go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so like I said, sometimes you run into problems with context, text, and subtext when dealing with music and advertising. Because what is that song that's being used in that ad, that Pepsi ad? It's Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, although the lyrics have been changed to be about Pepsi. In the original song, the text is about this girl, Billie Jean, who is accusing the speaker or the singer. In this case, we associate that with Michael Jackson, although we have to be careful. When dealing with music, songs, and poetry, we have to be careful not to associate the speaker of the poem or the singer of the song with the artist or poet, him or herself. But in this case, the implication is that Billie Jean, this young woman, is accusing Michael Jackson of fathering her child. And Michael Jackson, or the singer of the song, is denying that fact. So that's what the song is about on its own, but the text has changed by putting it into the ad. Pepsi or Michael Jackson has changed the lyrics, changed the text to fit Pepsi. And so changing the context has changed the meaning of the song, in this case, very literally. But at the same time, there's still an element of the original song there, because what is the message of the ad? The message of the ad is that Pepsi uh, unites different generations. It brings people together, old and young. And in this case, we see Michael Jackson being compared to a child who appears to be very similar to him, played by the actor Alfonso Ribeiro here. So there is that connection, that there is a father and son relationship going on, very similar to what the song Billie Jean is actually about. So I think that's a clever, personally, I think that's a clever use of that particular song to sell that particular product. Even though on the surface, the product and the song and the artist have really nothing to do with each other. Now, looking at it from a different direction, a more extreme gap between text and context is in the Honda Pilot ad. This one uses the Ozzy Osbourne song Crazy Train, although it's not the song itself, the actual recording. It's an a cappella version of it. So go and take a watch at that ad. Okay, so in this case, a much more extreme gap between what the song is about and the meaning, the way the meaning of the song changes by putting it into the ad. So, what is that song about? If you listen to the lyrics, it's all about feeling out of control in a world that has gone crazy. Specifically, it's dealing with the Cold War situation of the 1980s, and feeling that the world has gone mad, and being in a madhouse or being on a crazy train. So crazy train becomes the analogy in the song. Living in this world at that time was like being on a crazy train. So the text is about feeling this loss of control and a sense of going crazy. The subtext is it's really about uh, the Cold War of the 1980s. Putting it into the context of the ad, you do not get that message at all. What is that ad trying to say? The Honda Pilot will, I don't know, is it like a crazy train? I don't think that's what they're trying to say. You buy a Honda Pilot, go on a road trip with your family and go insane. I don't think that's what they're trying to say. Rather, it seems to be the opposite that they're trying to imply, that the Honda Pilot will bring your family closer together and you'll enjoy good times singing this song. Now, personally, I think that this is a really poor use of the song for a couple of reasons. First of all, the song just doesn't make sense within the context of the ad, even though it is a very recognizable song that a lot of people, many people have loved over the years. So the idea is that if you like this song, then you'll probably like this product as well, this minivan. But it's also problematic for me because I grew up in the 1980s and I listened to rock and heavy metal music, and for me, Ozzy Osbourne is the Prince of Darkness. So the idea that he and his music is being used to sell a Honda minivan is just, it's so it doesn't make sense. It's such an extreme change that it's really pretty heinous. I mean, there's a sense of selling out. So that particular ad bothers me for a couple of reasons, just on a personal level, but also at the same time, I don't think it makes sense to use that particular song. And then for a change of pace, take a look at the Cadbury Gorilla ad. I'm not going to discuss it here. It's just wonderfully absurd and silly and nonsensical. So just go ahead and take a look at that. Okay. Now, the reason why I'm discussing rhetoric and advertising, and in particular music and advertising, is that is one of the options for this assignment, your rhetorical analysis, is you can take an advertisement and sort of deconstruct it and break it down and identify the rhetorical strategies and appeals that are being used. And if you choose to go that route, because so many products and companies use these licensed songs in their ads, you have to take that into consideration as well. So that has to be part of your analysis. So if you choose an ad to analyze and it uses a licensed song, then you have to discuss the context of the text and the subtext. What does the song mean on its own? What's the literal meaning? What is the implied meaning? And how does that meaning change by putting it into the context of the ad? Because the song rhetorically is being used for a few reasons. It can be used as allusion because the idea is that people will be familiar with the song or with the artist, and so they will take their understanding of the song and apply it to the product or to the brand. It can be used as a form of authority, that sort of celebrity endorsement. And of course, there is the pathetic aspect as well, that it's being used to arouse emotion. Okay. Now let's shift over to discussing logic and fallacies. Now this is important too for a couple reasons. Again, for rhetorical analysis, we know that logos or the use of logic is a really important rhetorical appeal when it comes to arguing and persuasion. So when someone is making an argument that is rooted in logos, we have to be able to figure out if it actually makes sense or not. We have to judge the logic. And so we have to watch out for the use of logical fallacies. At the same time, if we are to be powerful as writers and use logos effectively ourselves, then we have to know these fallacies so that we can avoid using them, because we want to have strong, powerful arguments. And if you use fallacies, then that just weakens your argument. I've discussed logic a little bit early on when we first talked about arguments, but basically there's two types of logical reasoning that goes on in arguing, and that's deductive and inductive reasoning. And they move in opposite patterns. So deductive reasoning is when you go from something that's general to something that's specific. So you go from a general truth to reach a specific conclusion. And when we talked about syllogisms back when we discussed arguments, that's a classic example of deductive reasoning. That, if all people are mortal and Socrates was a person, then therefore Socrates was mortal. So you take that general truth and then you test it by looking at a specific example. Inductive reasoning moves in the opposite direction. It takes specific details, and from those it extrapolates or infers a more general conclusion. So, for example, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. It doesn't mean it has to be a duck. Could be somebody in a duck suit. But based on the available evidence, we can extrapolate or infer a larger conclusion that is reasonable. And I talked a little bit before about the differences between valid and sound reasoning. Valid reasoning is when your conclusion makes sense. It logically follows from your premises or from the evidence. So 1 plus 2 equals 3. That is valid because 3 is the product of 1 and 2. Sound reasoning is when the conclusion is valid, but also the premises that it's being based upon are true as well. So that classic syllogism of, all people are mortal, Socrates was a person, therefore Socrates was mortal. That is both valid and sound. It's valid because it's logical to conclude that if all people are mortal, and if Socrates was a person, therefore he must have been mortal. And those premises are true, or at least we have no evidence to the contrary. So we can say that that is a valid and a sound argument. In order to be sound, it has to be valid and true. If the argument, it's possible to have an argument that's valid but unsound. It's a weaker argument. But again, the test of validity is just, does it make sense? It doesn't have to be true. But if it is untrue, then that's unsound. Okay. So here's a list of some common fallacies, and I've also posted a handout on e-learning that gives more specific examples of these. And there are many, many fallacies out there, much more than are on this list. These are just probably, well, no, these are the most common ones that you come across in rhetoric and arguments, at least within contemporary society. And the handout that I've posted, the examples that I've included, all come from Donald Trump during his campaign for president. And the reason for that is I'm not trying to make any political statement there. The reason why I've chosen those examples is because Donald Trump is a very public and recognizable figure. And when he says things, they have real consequences. And so when he uses fallacies in his arguing, that it has consequences. So he's a very public figure. People pay attention to what he says, and he's in a position to really affect the world using his words. And so that's why I've chosen those specific examples, is because of who he is, not for, or rather, it's based on his position. So it's not really. I'm not making any political statement about it. Okay, so common fallacies, and get used to the Latin here. Ad hominem, which means to the man or against the man. This is the use of personal attacks. So you try to destroy the credibility of your opponent by attacking the opponent, him or herself, rather than attacking your opponent's argument. So when Donald Trump accuses someone of being dumb or stupid or ugly, that's what he's doing. It's a personal ad hominem attack meant to destroy that person's credibility. Ad misericordiam, I referenced this earlier. Ad misericordiam means to the pity, or roughly that's what it means. It is the use of emotional manipulation to distract. So, for example, going back to that Lyndon Johnson ad about the nuclear war, um, you'll see several fallacies in that ad, but that extreme fear mongering is a form of ad misericordiam. It's using emotional manipulation to distract. Ad populum, which is to the people, this is appealing to a public belief or popular sentiment. Whether it's right or wrong, the idea is that you're getting people on your side by just appealing to their prejudices. Bandwagon is somewhat similar, and most people know what bandwagon is. It's when you are doing something because it's popular or because it's perceived to be that everyone is doing it. So it's the everyone is doing it kind of fallacy. Begging the question, this gets confusing. Begging the question means that you're reaching a conclusion based on an unproven premise, or based on an assumption, rather. So your conclusion might sound reasonable on the surface, but if you think about it, well, it may not be true because you're basing your conclusion on an unproven assumption. So it ain't necessarily so, in other words. Dicto simplicator is to speak simply. It's an oversimplification of an issue. So you're ignoring the larger complexity of the issue and just sort of boiling it down to a one-liner, if you will. Similar to that, I'm jumping over false analogy for a moment here, but similar to dicto simplicator is false dichotomy, or black and white. This is when you present a scenario as an either or situation and you ignore all the other alternatives and options. So going back to that Lyndon Johnson ad with the nuclear explosion, he says that we must learn to love each other or we must die. It's an either or situation that he presents, and that is the false dichotomy. And it's an oversimplification of the issue. So again, it's a dicto simplicator. Now, false analogy. We know that analogies are comparisons of two things highlighting or emphasizing the way that they function or the way that they behave. The idea is you can explain a difficult concept by comparing it to something simpler and easier to understand. And if it's true of one thing, then it's true of the other as well. That's the idea. So the false analogy is when you're comparing two things that aren't related, that there is no point of comparison. They do not function or behave the same. And then hasty generalization is one that most people are familiar with. It's when you reach a conclusion based on too limited a sample of data. So you might have two instances of something bad happening. And from that, you say, well, that's something bad always happens in that situation. And that's a hasty generalization. You can't make that conclusion because there's not enough evidence to support it. Non sequitur, it does not follow. Literally, it means it does not follow. This is when the conclusion has nothing to do with the premises. It's going in a completely different direction. So if 1 plus 2 equals 5, that doesn't make sense. Or even if you say that 1 plus 2 equals eggplant, that's a better example of a non sequitur. It's something which is completely off topic and makes no sense. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after it, therefore because of it. So this is the fallacy of causation. So it's when someone claims that an event caused negative consequences, even though there's no evidence to support that. The only evidence is that event preceded those consequences. So the idea is because it happened afterwards, that event must have been the cause of it. And it's possible there could be some correlation. It's possible that event was a contributing factor, but that event, unless you have more evidence, that event probably did not cause those consequences. And then, for the moment, jumping over the red herring, slippery slope is kind of the opposite situation. That's where if you allow something to happen, it's going to result in a chain reaction that will end up in catastrophe. So if you give a mouse a cookie, for example, you'll end up burning down your house, something along those lines. Probably not going to happen, but that's the idea of the slippery slope. If you allow one thing to happen, it's going to cause a chain reaction. Red herring, then, is kind of the hey, look over there argument. It's when you're trying to distract from the weakness of your own argument by pointing in the opposite direction. So it's the use of distraction. That's basically what the red herring is. And then the straw man is when you misrepresent your opponent's argument because the misrepresentation becomes easier to attack than the actual argument itself. And again, take a look at that handout that I posted because you will see that all of these are being used in that handout. So there are legitimate real world examples of these that we come across really every day, just about. So you have to be on the lookout for those. Again, if you're evaluating someone's argument, you have to be able to analyze it and deconstruct the logic to see if it actually makes sense and if it's logically true, if it's valid or not. But again, you also have to know these arguments so that you can avoid falling into that trap yourself. So here's a post from Facebook several years ago now. It's not very recent, but it does deal with a contemporary or a topical issue, which is raising the minimum wage. So let's just pause a moment here, read this, and try to identify how many fallacies are present. How many did you see? I count at least 5 in there. So let's say, okay, rent. For those fast food employees striking for $15 an hour, let's do some math. It sounds like it's going to be reasonable because it's looking at math and equations. Those are hard facts, right? At $15 an hour, Johnny Fryboy would make $31,200 annually. First fallacy, Johnny Fryboy. That's an ad hominem attack. And E1 private in the military makes $18,378. And E5 sergeant with 8 years of service only makes $35,067 annually. Okay. That may be true, although personally I don't have those figures in front of me, so I can't verify those. But let's say for the sake of argument that those figures are true. Those two things, comparing Johnny Fryboy here, or the fast food employee, to someone in the military, is a false analogy. Because even though, yes, again, for the sake of argument, that may be the amount of money that members of the military make, members of the military get extra compensation in the form of housing and healthcare and all of these other benefits that fast food employees do not. So that's a false analogy. You can't compare the two. So you're telling me, Solly McBurger Flipper, again, another ad hominem, that you deserve as much as those kids getting shot at, deploying for months in hostile environments, and putting their collective asses on the line every day protecting your unskilled butts? Okay. Ad misericordiam right there. And probably a little ad populum as well. So emotional manipulation and appealing to a public or popular prejudice. Here's the deal, Baconator. Another ad hominem. You're working in a job designed for a kid in high school who is learning how to work and earning enough for gas and hanging out with their equally goofy high school pals. If you have chosen this as your lifelong profession, you have failed. Again, ad populum, ad hominem, ad misericordiam. If you don't want minimum wage, don't have minimum skills. Dicto simplicator. Okay. So, and not just dicto simplicator, but a false dichotomy. So yeah, there's at least 5 fallacies present in this argument. Now, I'm not arguing for or against raising the minimum wage because valid arguments can be made on both sides of the issue. I'm just pointing out that this is not a valid argument. Okay, and so finally, let's talk a little bit about the due dates here. So the final draft of the first essay, that's the evaluation paper, that's due at the end of this week. And then the first draft of the next essay, which is the rhetorical analysis, that's due at the end of next week. So this week, you have your final draft of the evaluation. Next week is the first draft of the rhetorical analysis. Okay, and that's it for this week. Hopefully you found this interesting or at least educational. And I'm really looking forward to what you are able to do in your rhetorical analyses. And if you choose to analyze an advertisement, first of all, whatever text you choose to analyze, I need to have access to it. So if you're analyzing an editorial or an advertisement, you need to send me the link to that editorial or advertisement so that I can analyze it for myself and make sure that you've correctly identified what's going on in them. And then again, if you want to analyze an advertisement and it uses music, you have to be able to consider the text, subtext, and context of the song as well, because that is going to be part of the argument that the advertiser is presenting. Okay, so I hope you have some fun with this. And again, I look forward to reading what you come up with. So take it easy and take care.